There we are. Within zoo-based conservation, for me, there are three strands. On the bottom left, you can see breeding threatened species for potential release into the wild, if that becomes necessary. So the old zoo paradigm, insurance populations, and it's about buying time for wild populations, restocking wild populations when that becomes necessary, sometimes reintroducing wild populations when they have gone extinct completely. And then field conservation and research emerged in the sort of early to mid 1990s as a role of zoological gardens. What we want to achieve there is we want to build a national center for species survival at Dublin Zoo, and I won't tell you much about what a national center for species survival does, because I'm hoping that the speaker after me, Mileham, will enlighten you a little bit about that. We also want to increase our expenditure on conservation fivefold over the next 10 years in the lifetime of this plan, and really invest into evidence-based species and habitat conservation. And then one of the most important roles also of zoos and aquariums, and presumably also of botanic gardens, and we'll hear later from Matthew about those, is behavior change and advocacy. We have 1.25 million visitors coming through Dublin Zoo every year, and they are of course a huge audience, and we want to make them a joint force for nature conservation, for wildlife conservation. And in order to do that, we need to set an example. We want to influence our visitors to actually take action, not to just raise awareness, as zoos and aquariums have done for many decades, but we want people to take action. And this is, via behavior change campaigns. So we will do 3, maybe even more, but we've committed to 3 over the lifetime of our 10-year vision, and want to change small consumer behaviors initially towards more wildlife-friendly action among our audience. In terms of breeding threatened species, you can see that at the moment we are about half of our collection, about 53%, are currently coordinated in joint breeding programs and international coordinated breeding programs. We want to increase that percentage to at least 75% over the next 10 years to really say, to be able to say hand on heart to every visitor coming through the gates at Dublin Zoo, your entrance fee, excuse me, goes towards conservation. We are a conservation zoo, and many of the species in the collection are, of course, in the threatened categories on the IUCN red list already. And here you can see, just as an example, where we currently support conservation projects. You can see 4 of them in Ireland up on the right-hand side there, and then we are very Africa and Madagascar heavy, and quite a few also in Asia, just 2 in the neotropics. What we want to achieve over the next 10 years also is having a more balanced split between Ireland and the rest of the world, so hopefully 50-50, roughly, with 50% going into native species conservation and 50% of the investment going internationally into conservation projects. And that is already it. I think I've used up my 5 minutes, so thank you very much. I will hand over back to Andrew, and I'm sure we'll see some very good examples of all these different areas of zoo-based conservation over the next hour and a bit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christoph. And if anyone's coming to Zoo Social tonight, feel free to grab Christoph and ask him any questions. Next up, we have a very special guest. Dr. Mileham is joining us from Australia. Kira is the Director of Strategic Partnerships with the IUCN Species Survival Commission, and she's going to talk to us about conservation collaborations and how we as a country can present a more unified approach to reversing the red for native species.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and hi everyone. It's such a privilege to be here joining you at your National Biodiversity Conference. I'd like to just start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country from which I'm joining you on, the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the role that they've played for thousands of years in caring for the land and species in the land on which I'm joining you from. But it's such a privilege to be here. As Andrew said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about conservation collaborations and my experiences through working as the Strategic Partnership Director for the IUCN Species Survival Commission. Just want to quickly check, can someone give me a thumbs up if they can hear me okay and see my slides? Yep,
Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh, no, hang on, now it's playing weird things. Hang on, sorry, everyone. Sorry, 1 second. Oh gosh, sorry, it's doing strange things with a video that we embedded not very long ago. Can you see it okay if I just leave it in this mode, or is that a mess?
We can't see anything, we can just see you now, Kira.
All right, sorry everyone, just bear with me for 1 second. I just have to make a quick adjustment to the file. Sorry. I think I sorted it, everyone. Sorry, we had a few technical changes at the last minute today, but I think I've now sorted it. Can everyone see it again?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So I'll start again. So yeah, I'm going to talk just briefly about conservation collaborations and some of the work that we've been doing as part of the IUCN Species Survival Commission and through our partnerships globally. Andrew mentioned that I work for the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and hopefully you're all, if not most of you, familiar with IUCN, but it was founded just over 70 years ago on the premise that if we are able to successfully unite volunteer experts across diverse fields of nature conservation with member organisations, whether they're state or federal government agencies, NGOs, Indigenous peoples groups, or other kinds of organisations serving to protect nature, with a backbone of staff in offices around the world. If we can bring those three pillars together, then surely through our expertise and capacity, we can make a real, genuine and sustainable difference to nature-based solutions and protecting and preserving biodiversity. And so that's the premise for which IUCN is founded, which is so relevant to your discussions about your National Biodiversity Action Plan and biodiversity conservation in Ireland. And I work for a part of the IUCN, which is more relevant, which is the Species Survival Commission, which is a science-based network of more than 10,000 volunteer species conservation experts who are working across freshwater, terrestrial, marine environments, and on a diverse array of species across fungi, plants, and animals, and are based in 174 countries around the world. And these experts share a commitment to a process called the species conservation cycle. Now, for any of you who are program managers or project managers in any way, you probably recognize this as a basic performance management cycle. It's not rocket science, but it's our approach to species conservation across the IUCN SSC. It's to first undertake assessments to understand the situation and to help inform prioritization processes. This can sometimes take the form of IUCN Red List assessments, which hopefully quite a few of you are familiar with. You may have even participated in, and these can happen at the global or national level. But assessments are also things like our green status to assess the recovery potential or the recovery effectiveness of a program or species, key biodiversity areas, which takes into account ecosystem factors as well as species factors to help inform prioritization processes at a spatial level. So these kind of assessment tools that feed into helping us make informed science-based decisions. And then we take those assessments and feed them into multi-stakeholder planning processes, like the National Biodiversity Action Planning process that you're in at the moment. But sometimes that's at a global level or national or even subnational and local or individual species level. And then obviously we want to make sure that those plans are mobilized into action as effectively as possible. And this works best when it is treated as a cycle, when it feeds back into assessment. So again, this aligns really nicely with the process that you're undertaking in Ireland to have been up to now your 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan and constantly reviewing to look at where improvements can be made and where priorities are shifting. But as IUCN SSC, one of our highest priorities is in recognition of the fact that most of the tools and the networks that we have focus at on species conservation at the global level. But most conservation work is actioned at the national or subnational to local levels. And so a big priority at the moment is working with leading partners around the world to better figure out how we can come alongside government agency processes, in particular national biodiversity action plans, and support the implementation and effective connection of that plan to the global tools, resources, partnerships that we might have and might be able to bring in support of that process and implementation. And one approach that we are big advocates of is the one plan approach. Really looking at how to unite. Christoph just mentioned the role of some of the roles of ex situ conservation organisations like Dublin Zoo. And the one plan approach really advocates for the development of management strategies and actions by all responsible parties for all populations of a species, whether they're inside or outside their natural range. And that can be through highly managed situations of species in human care in zoos, through to softly managed sanctuaries and fenced environments and more in the wild, right through to free ranging in the wild. But the one plan approach really advocates that we all come together and bring diverse expertise into figuring out how to implement and develop and implement comprehensive action plans across those situations, but also bringing in other expertise, like Christoph just mentioned, things like social science and behavior change and advocacy and many of the other skills that contribute to comprehensive species recovery programs. And along those lines, the IUCN SSC is in the final draft stages of developing a position statement in support of the role of zoos, aquariums, and botanic gardens in species conservation. As Andrew mentioned, the role of ex situ organisations has for a long time been overlooked in many parts of the world, or relegated just to the management of small populations, or called in at the 11th hour when populations have crashed so small that they can't possibly be recovered in the wild. However, the expertise and the opportunities to work as a holistic conservation community, working alongside and with ex situ conservation organisations are enormous, spanning things like everything Christoph just talked about, but also the husbandry, the pathology, the veterinary science, genetic management, the behaviour change and social science elements, fundraising. These organisations often have really strong partnerships locally, nationally and internationally with lots of different types of organisations, and also really strong supply chains often with companies that they procure all kinds of different products through for their venues, and obviously experience in rescue and release, both for native and often exotic species as well. These are the kinds of expertise that we as IUCN SSC have been increasingly engaging with the ex situ community around the world to really further species conservation initiatives, and are excited to see this conversation happening as part of your National Biodiversity Action Plan in Ireland, because we really advocate for these in situ, ex situ partnerships to be at the heart of national biodiversity action plans. And this is one of my favorite quotes. It's a personal mantra of mine, but this was delivered by a woman called Sally Jewell to the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016. And she challenged the IUCN community, saying that conservation needs to move beyond random acts of kindness and instead mobilize strategic, coordinated action. Too often, even when we have national biodiversity action plans, the projects identified within them are treated as silo projects, and the teams work on them in isolation from one another. And so we're really trying to see how we can support, and I'm not saying that's the case in Ireland, but we're really trying to see if there's anything we and our partners that we're working with can do to support a much more holistic, comprehensive conservation community working together on species priorities and helping to coordinate the initiatives between individual prioritized projects. And at the heart of that, as I've said, is those national biodiversity action plans. They're such a fundamental document for identifying priorities, pulling together that coordinated strategy, and then looking for the gaps for which we can all help to then fill. And one of the ways that we're helping with that is through an initiative called the IUCN Reverse the Red, which IUCN SSC is working on with key partners like the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums and a number of others. we're just about to sign on the Botanic Garden Conservation International as well. And this is a global movement looking at how to reverse the negative trends shown on IUCN Red List to protect species and ecosystems. But at its heart, its focus is about, as I've said, coming alongside national level players, so government agencies, NGOs and others at the national and subnational level, looking at how can we better connect tools and resources and expertise that we might have into supporting these national biodiversity action plans. And we're not going to pretend that this is a one size fits all. It looks different in every country and for every national biodiversity action plan. We believe that there are 4 key pillars at the heart of saving species. One of those is mobilizing national networks. And that comes back to what I was saying about the ethos of the establishment of IUCN, is if we can effectively unite diverse experts and scientists and practitioners working on the ground with government agencies, NGOs, Indigenous peoples groups, with a backbone of staff that are well-resourced and capacity-rich, that have the ability to move forward initiatives. If we can unite those 3 pillars at a national level to then implement biodiversity action plans and help inform that assess, plan, act cycle at the national level, then I think we'll get a lot further towards achieving the post-2020 biodiversity framework at the country level. But we also believe, as Christoph touched on as well, that empowering communities and not just raising awareness, but genuinely driving behaviour change and advocacy is really key to biodiversity solutions in this coming decade. And we've seen movements like the climate movement start to take a lot more momentum in the last decade, but we really haven't seen biodiversity keep pace with that wave. Biodiversity really hasn't managed to get up on the social agenda in the same way that climate and protected areas have so far. And that's only even looking at the nature space. There's a lot of work we can do to better engage the communities that we're all working in saving species and undertaking advocacy, but also personal behaviours to contribute to biodiversity conservation. We also really believe that we have to change the narrative in biodiversity conservation. So often it's still about doom and gloom and all of the species that we've lost or are losing, rather than focusing on the stories of success and the optimism and hope that exists in biodiversity conservation. We know how to save species. There are countless examples around the world. We just need to be doing more of it and more effectively in collaboration with one another and strategically. And that comes down as well to measuring impact. And so these are the 4 pillars of Reverse the Red, but it's really great to see each of these 4 pillars in different ways with slightly different language in the National Biodiversity Action Plan for Ireland. And so I'm really excited that I think there's lots of work that we can all do together. And one of the ways that we're helping to mobilise national networks and to work on connecting these global tools and global IUCN processes at the national level is by working with leading zoos and aquariums and botanic gardens around the world and creating staff teams within these institutions that are helping to catalyse Assess, Plan, Act, and working alongside government agencies and national players, national NGOs and other organisations to help us unite the volunteer expert networks of IUCN working on species in the country, but also to help work on bringing together those collaborations to support the implementation of national biodiversity action plans. We call these centres for species survival, and we have, although this model is still new, it's only about 5 years old, we have a growing number of partners working with us around the world and now have a staff team of 30 staff in different countries around the world. And we're really excited to be talking to Dublin Zoo about this model and about what this could look like in the context of Ireland and your National Biodiversity Action Plan. And just finally, really what this is about is just strengthening the paradigms we all have in species conservation, knowing that the work happens on the ground, that it's led by nationally identified priorities and then community engagement at the local level and champions working at the local level. But how do we better connect? How do we better overcome this gap and the opportunities that exist between global toolkits and global systems and integrating that to regional priorities and national action plans? And if we can find a way to unite these collaborations effectively between national, local and global levels, then I really think that we can reverse the declines and reverse the red for the species at a national and global level. If you want to know more about Reverse the Red, check out the website. But again, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I think it's really great to see this discussion happening, and in such a whole of government, whole of society approach. Really strongly encourage, especially those in situ, ex situ links, because they're very important, but also sharing and learning from other countries that are doing this, and sharing your process and your knowledge as you go through this process as well with other countries, which the CBD platform is so important for. But thanks so much again, and that's all from me.
Thank you, Kira, for that very, very inspiring talk. And following on from that, and about amplifying successes and talking about some of our success stories, next up we have Andrea Dempsey from West African Primate Conservation Action, who are a long-term conservation partner of Dublin Zoo and really do provide a good roadmap on how zoos, aquariums and botanical gardens can become involved in situ conservation. So yeah, Andrea next.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting the work of WAPCA, but also to demonstrate Dublin Zoo's role in the work that we do, because I love Dublin Zoo to start with, and I'm not just saying that because Christoph is staring at me, but everything that they stand for is just phenomenal, and it's a world-leading, if not one of the best zoos in the world. So I'm Andrea Dempsey, I'm the program manager, and is it that way? There we are. This is my team. They work incredibly hard to make me look very good at conferences like this, and I'd just like to take the time to acknowledge them and introduce them to you. On the left is Charles, he's one of our field officers. Next to him is Foster, he works with our ex situ populations. That's me. Veronica is our project support officer. Nuria is our education and research officer, David is our in situ project coordinator, and Martin is another field officer. And as I say, they work incredibly hard to make me look good. Okay. So WAPCA focuses on primates, monkeys in particular. We don't go near those dirty apes. And we work with the rollaway monkey, the white-naped mangabey, the patas monkey, the Diana monkey, and the black and white-thighed colobus, all of which are at risk of extinction, with the rollaway and the black and white-thighed colobus critically endangered according to the red list. And if you do go to the zoo this afternoon, which I obviously recommend, you will see a wonderful population of white-naped mangabeys there. We do also focus on Miss Waldron's colobus, but unfortunately we probably think that this monkey is now extinct. We haven't seen a specimen since 2008. We have had some reports from local people, but we've not actually seen it. So unfortunately we probably got too late to protect this one, but we hope that we will prevent the other ones from going extinct. So how do we work? As Kira has very nicely explained, we follow the one plan approach. And by doing this, as all conservation should, including all those responsible partners, we ensure that our conservation is effective, it's inclusive, and importantly, it's sustainable. And we do that through 4 pillars: discover, protect, reinforce, and connect. So discover. We have the WAPCA research group, and this predominantly is doing surveys across the historical range of our focus monkeys, and we're trying to find populations, and then when we find them, we can then protect them. We do this inclusively, so we partner with international students, with Ghanaian students, so we promote local institutions, but also promoting primatology in country, and making sure that all people are included on any publications, and this is funded by zoos. We also use the research to measure our impact and also to monitor our welfare with our captive populations. So when we find them, we need to protect them. And we do this in a completely, I knew I'd bring my notes up and not look, sorry. We do this in a completely community-based way. So we work with our communities to establish CREMAs, which are community resource management areas. And this through the submission of their constitution, their bylaws, the government give them the power to manage their natural resources. So it's completely run by the communities, and then through that they can do patrols, they can do tree nurseries, and they can do conservation education. And WAPCA supports that and facilitates that. But also WAPCA recognises that's sometimes the failure of NGOs, that there's no sustainability to it, that they throw money at the project, but they're not looking at the people side. People need to live and eat and survive, so creating a benefit and sharing mechanism so that they can all be supported. But as I say, it's completely community driven, so rather than me talk about it, I'm going to let them.
Let's take a closer look at the coconut oil value chain developed in the western region of Ghana. Since 2014, WAPCA has been working with the Ankasa Tunnel Kramer to protect their forest and wildlife resources.
Kramer ye communities a yaka ye ho abom a ye boa abo ye japade efa nnua ene mmoa ene niema atwa ye ho ahia obade de ache ye no. Kramer no mo ye monitor team leader a me boa ama nkrofo ye corporations niema amanfo ese no wo emu no ye boa ama omo agya eyo.
In partnership with Noe and the Savannah Fruits Company, WAPCA is working with the Kramer to develop an organic virgin coconut oil community enterprise.
And a kuo bi buy from WAPCA. And on work as a kubi no so mo boy na omo bie kuo bi na mo eye enwo.
Farmers and producers are supported with equipment, trainings, and market access for their certified products.
Bitiasia no omo kire the way I betumi aye organic. Enti organic no omo kire ye se ema obia enye emfa widi site enwunafuom afi efu no obi so bo hyen enti nipa na wona no boundary no ete se wunya some meters bia kubesi wa ni kwansa wodi gu organic kube no mu
obo kire ye se adwuma no ye ro kube da se a baba ye fa nkoda enye adwuma eche se nkoda no obo bepira ye fa mpenufo fa enye adwuma no eda Roberts ebe no numsuo wum no bebe ye tutungu kube na se eda kube na ho no ye tungu kube na se abada ye fertilizer amai
ekunu ye ma na yo me nam 30 na ye cheye mu group na ye 6 na ye adwuma ye ne Savannah Food Company for na ye adwuma omo no mo bie adwuma na wo ho no kuro no so ede ma ye na omo so na omo freye e de kire sini ebe ya adwuma na ya nyampa so afrum.
Giving local population, especially women, the means and opportunity to improve their income empowers them economically and offers them the power to come out of poverty and to better support their families.
Biya faso wo say obo beto mi kube no etu ya ka mame ekire so mo wo bonus so a omo de be mame. The
opening of a new processing center in Elenda will further increase the benefits to the community members of the Kramer.
Factory bi wo ha na mabaha se me baba ye factory ni bi ye kubanwa kubena anwa na ye no mo se ye friend virgin oil na ye mfa so de bebre kurom ne se aho kire ba ha no ebe ma aho kire na abrase ama sisi adwuma no mo abebie no boys ne mayo mo ha no ye benya adwuma aye ebinum baba ba ye adwuma mo anya sika ama de omo pese omo de sika ne ye no betumi ade aye ama ho kire na aba no so atwa ama ye nti na ye so ya ba factory no mu bi.
The development of the coconut value chain also benefits the Kramer. A conservation agreement was signed between the Savannah Fruits Company and the Kramer with a contribution of the company to the conservation fund.
No kre yenya mpaso wom esan say kube dudu obi ombeto no ye to kube ba ku bia ye ma 1 peso the communities no ya form nyina no omoso e ma ye sika a ye de ebo Kramer no ho ban.
As a result, the Kramer becomes more autonomous and less reliant on external support. Solutions to eco-degradation and biodiversity loss require community-based management of natural resources and sound economic alternatives. Developing sustainable value chains offers local communities an economic and social stepping stone while empowering them to protect and sustain their forests.
towards coconut and coconut oil. We also do that with organic cocoa. And we're looking to do it with cassava, which is like a root vegetable. And then we confirmed populations of white-naped mangabey and rollaway in another forest in Cape Three Point, and we're now replicating that model there as well. So we've started the creamer elections, and they're going to be looking at honey production and ecotourism as their way of sustaining their project after the external funding has gone. But we don't just disappear and run away. We're there. We just make sure that they can be sustainable and are empowered and have the resources to feed their family and without having to go into the forest to supplement their income. So we discover them, we protect them, but there is deforestation, there is fragmentation. So we are looking at whether we can reinforce these populations of monkeys. So we started predominantly at the Endangered Primate Breeding Centre as a rescue and rehab. There is a lot of pet trade, there's a lot of bushmeat that causes individuals to be without their mothers. So we brought them into the centre, rehabilitated them, put them into the social groups, and we actually started, we joined the EEP, which is the European Endangered Programme, where we're able to diverse the genetic makeup of European populations by exchanging animals. So we actually exchange animals between Ghana and Europe. And we now house 19 mangabeys in 4 breeding social groups and 1 rollaway, but he is getting a female soon, so he'll have a wife not too long. And then with this population, we started looking at, and with the protection of the forests, whether we could look at conservation, translocation of these captive bred animals. So we built a 0.4 hectare natural area in Kamasi Zoo, which is a little bit higher up, which now houses 9 mangabeys in 1 big group. And this is a study group, so they're not on show, people can't see them, and it's looking to see whether or how they adapt to a more natural environment in terms of diet, behavior, compared to more traditional enclosures. And we're looking now seriously into the feasibility of conservation, translocating them, working with Wildlife Vets International, IUCN, the EP, and Wildlife Tech as well. And if it is possible, then we'll look at it. But we will only do it if it has conservation value. And if at the end of the feasibility study we don't do it, we will take it off the table. It is not a publicity stunt. It will only do it if it has conservation value. And the forest enclosure is a very nice place to live for the monkeys. And then lastly, we connect conservation education. This is a Friends for Wildlife program that we run in partnership with Five Sisters Zoo, and they exchange letters between a school in Scotland and a school in Ghana, and then they also do the same activities. We obviously have the zoo, Accra Zoo, where the Endangered Primate Breeding Centre is. So obviously we get lots of school children. As much as I hate children, I tolerate them because apparently it's important. We do, especially in urban areas where they might not get to the forest, so we do tree planting exercises. We run a couple of radio programs as well, so for more the adult demographic, where they can phone in and talk about wildlife laws and when they can hunt and when they can't hunt. We're not about saying no, we're just saying, if you do it this, or you hunt this instead, because we have to understand the traditional and cultural aspects of these things. And of course, one of the great things, the bottom picture, we did some camera trapping in Scotland and camera trapping in Ghana. And in Scotland, they just got squirrels. And in Ghana, they got pangolins, pottos, civets. It's a bit like, oh, never mind. And then the top is Mangabey Awareness Day, which is celebrated, as I'm sure you're all aware of, the 1st of August. So feel free to join us in celebrating that. And we do a big event, and these are Mangabey masks. And we do that across lots of zoos that hold mangabeys, be it white-naped or cherry-crowned, which is a nice picture that Christoph had. We all celebrate this species that not many people actually know about. People often think it's a giant bee or something like that, so it's about celebrating that as well. So at the beginning, I was sort of talking about how zoos connect with what WAPCA does. And essentially the take-home message for me is, without zoos, all the stuff I've just told you about wouldn't happen. Our core funding, the stuff that funds the boring stuff like electricity and fuel that isn't very sexy, is funded by zoos. So they're all members, and they give a membership, And they go above and beyond that as well. Sometimes if they have extra funds, even through COVID, they were giving us extra money. Or we can study the animals in zoos closely and we can apply that to the field. There's so many ways that zoos contribute, but fundamentally WAPCA wouldn't exist without them. And particularly Dublin Zoo. Dublin Zoo, I believe, was a founding zoo of WAPCA. So when the zoos all got together and were looking for something to support in West Africa for the species that they had in their collections, Dublin Zoo was one of the first to go, yep, I'll give you some money and get started. And just to put a microscope on Dublin Zoo a little bit further, if you are involved in funding applications, often they won't fund salaries or vehicles. And Dublin Zoo funded us to be able to get a new vehicle. And without a vehicle, we can't take tree nurseries to the field. We can't take school kids to a project. They're really fundamental. So Dublin Zoo supported that. Uniform, it doesn't have to be financial. It doesn't have to be a big drain. But Dublin Zoo sent us about 6 boxes of uniforms to the post office in Accra. I told my husband, who's actually from Dublin, they were full of Super Queen sausages, and that made him help me, and he was a bit disappointed when it was just uniform. Supporting surveys to maybe discover Miss Waldron's colobus again, wild tech, so hopefully wildlife tech, we're going to be taking some thermal imaging of the mangabes at Dublin Zoo, and then we can use that as reference if we release mangabes to see if we can monitor them in the wild. So we're going to be collecting that data at Dublin Zoo. And lastly, the forested enclosure that I spoke again, Dublin Zoo came forward with maybe I think 2 other zoos and stumped up a load of cash so that we could build this amazing 0.4 hectare enclosure, which, as I say, if we don't release the mangabes, and we might not, it's just an awesome enclosure. I love it. And the monkeys that lived there, 2 of them, Sonia and Nuba, were confiscated. They were taken as small monkeys, probably from their mother. Mother was probably killed, and we were able to give them this space. So we're giving them a little bit of the wild back. And I'm just going to end my presentation. So just to say, a huge thank you to Dublin Zoo. You're awesome. And we wouldn't be able to do half the stuff without you. And a huge thank you from me and from my Ghanaian team. And just to end on a small video of the forest enclosure, if this works. This is my favourite Ghanaian song. My husband told me not to dance, so I am sang rooted. So this is Nuba, so he was the one that was brought in as a small offspring. And the tunnel goes to a satellite enclosure that sort of is more traditional, but they go out and off they go. So as we say in Ghana, Madasi pa pa pa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. And Andrea kept thanking Dublin Zoo, but really thank you, everyone who actually comes to Dublin Zoo. Without people coming to Dublin Zoo, we couldn't help support projects like WAPCA. So every time you buy a ticket, some of that is going to help Andrea and the mangabes in West Africa. So next up, we have a dual presentation. We have Laura Gardner, Conservation Director at WIldwood Trust in the UK, and Suzanne Kynaston, Conservation Project Officer with WIldwood Trust in the UK, to talk about the red-billed chough reintroduction programme happening in Kent and how it can be used as a blueprint for other species moving forward, and a particular importance then on local engagement in that process too. So please welcome both of them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dublin, to Christoph and Andrew for hosting us today. We're delighted to talk to you about our very exciting project. Where are we going? Okay, right, just get that. So as Andrew kindly introduced us, I'll just sort of move on. I know we've really struggled to condense the talk into 10 minutes because we could both talk for months about the red-billed chough because we are just so passionate about it. So essentially, in 2018, when I first started at WIldwood Trust, I started looking at actually, we're a native species conservation organisation dedicated to the protection, conservation, and where feasible, the reintroduction of native species. And in terms of the mention today of the one plan approach, there really is no excuse for us to deliver that one plan approach. We've got it all on our doorstep. We don't have to go thousands of miles to do in-country restoration. We can do it here. So looked at other conservation partners with a shared vision, and Kent Wildlife Trust were on the doorstep. And so I think, it made sense to me to reach out to them to look at having a shared vision for a wilder Kent. And so dovetailing our respective skill sets, obviously Wildwood can bring conservation breeding, techniques and reintroduction skills to the project, whereas Kent Wildlife Trust, in terms of land and habitat management, it made complete sense to align our skill sets so we can maximise our conservation impact. So in terms of the red-billed chough, our main conservation projects are to restore a free-living managed population on the White Cliffs of Dover of about 50 birds within 10 years of the first release. And we're looking at doing our first releases later this summer. We want to develop and publish best practice guidelines for successful chough reintroduction. We want to restore the biodiversity of Kent's coastal chalk grassland and maritime habitats, but using the chough as a flagship species to do this. To involve residents and local communities through public engagement, educational programs, and economic opportunities to support a local identity and culture around the chough. And to develop academic and citizen science research opportunities to increase our understanding of chough ecology. So essentially, our project involves three main components. So we have the species reintroduction, which drives and supports ongoing habitat restoration, and that seeks direct engagement with local communities. So a few facts about red-billed chough. It's the rarest member of the crow family in the British Isles. There we go. It's a species of European conservation concern and is Schedule 1 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And it's a sedentary species. It remains local to a site and is a poor disperser, and that really means that without support, it's unlikely to recolonise Kent. It's been missing from the Kentish landscape for over 200 years. So what we want to do is to use the red-billed chough as a flagship species. It's charismatic, it's iconic. Actually, it's been really great to talk to so many of you here today because you know what a red-billed chough is. In Kent, although culturally it's, Suzanne is going to tell you a little bit about the cultural connection of the species in Kent, people just really have forgotten what it is. So it's fantastic to engage with you today. So obviously having that sort of flagship species, which is so closely linked to rare and important maritime grassland next to the coastal cliffs for which the species use for nesting. And obviously there's been probably 30 years of chalk maritime grassland restoration work already undertaken. So that means there's suitable habitat to restore the species into already along the White Cliffs. So in terms of the history of chough and why they're declining and what the current population is, so they were once widespread across the United Kingdom and Ireland, but unfortunately now their population is small, they have become small and isolated. The decline in Kent appeared to mark the beginning of the species' nationwide range contraction, which in England was largely from east to west, and is linked historically to changing land use, agricultural intensification, and persecution. But with the natural recolonisation of chough in Cornwall since 2001 and the Jersey reintroduction, the current population stands at approximately 550 pairs in the British Isles. So what do choughs need? So they're an insectivorous bird, so they need to gain access to subsoil and some surface living invertebrates. And the habitats that enable that are short grasslands such as coastal strips of maritime heath and short grazed pasture. However, we have learned from studying the birds in Jersey and Cornwall that they're extremely versatile and adaptable. And they'll utilise lots of different sites of short grassland, including racecourses, dirt bike trails, road, farm track, footpath verges, village gardens, dry stone walls, basically anywhere where they have access to the soil. They will also seek out invertebrates in animal dung as an easy food source. So ideally a mosaic of vegetation is optimal for the chough, which provides multiple opportunities for forage and feed, and also to prevent the soil becoming too dry during the summer and too frozen in the winter, because the birds need to probe the soil to find these invertebrates. Nesting habitat is usually along the sea cliffs and caves, although birds will also use man-made structures such as quarries, old mines, and similar buildings, and where provided they will also use artificial nest boxes. So where will the birds come from? So Andrea was talking about conservation translocation, but as I said, the species populations have become isolated and fragmented. So those remnant populations, the genetic work suggests that those are really sort of genetically depleted now. So what we want to be doing is tapping into, this is where the role of zoos really sort of comes into its own. So there is a zoo in Cornwall called Paradise Park that has been running a captive breeding program for chough for over 30 years, and that's a genetically managed program. And researchers suggested that that population is more diverse, genetically diverse, than many of the remnant wild populations. So that will be the source population for not only our project, but hopefully future chough restoration projects. And that zoo population is managed under the auspices of the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. Additional to that, incubation and breeding facilities have been expanded upon both at Paradise Park in Cornwall, but also at WIldwood Trust. And these are specifically to support these reintroduction projects. So, building upon the techniques developed at Jersey Zoo between 2013 and 2018 released or did a species reintroduction, a restoration of the chough population on the island of Jersey. So we're very lucky to have that model to learn from. And they developed a lot of techniques, rearing techniques, to maximise the opportunities of having a captive population and how we can utilise that to support releases and reintroductions in the wild. So we've got a lot of data from their birds and what they've been doing over that 5-year period, and there have been a sort of review under the IUCN Species Translocation Guidebook, suggesting that that is now regarded as a successful release project with over 43 birds living independently in Jersey. So what we're learning from this project is that the best way to do this and to replicate this is releasing small cohorts of birds each year, so sort of family-sized groups between the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll be using a mixture of not only parent-reared birds from the breeding program, but also hand-reared and creche-reared birds. So we're maximising the opportunities for breeding. And the optimum time to release these birds is actually this sort of critical window of learning, which is post-fledging. So it's sort of from sort of the sort of branching or bouldering phase that we'd be putting birds back into the wild. And this is where they would be naturally forming flocks of juvenile birds. Having creche-reared birds is also shown to anchor the birds to the release site for longer, and again, that's really important for post-release monitoring. Hand rearing or creche rearing, where you've got lots of birds being reared together, so imprint on each other. You don't want to get birds imprinting on people. It also allows you to have a good understanding of the individual personalities of each bird that you release. And that's really important. And there's been a lot of projects that we've been able to learn from, particularly the chough is very an intelligent, social species. And the individuals within each cohort, the personality of those individuals can have an impact on the success of that cohort in terms of dispersal, finding food and breeding success. And a mix, so far the data shows that the best mix for each cohort is to have a mix of bold and timid birds. And as cohorts get released over sort of further on down the line, it might be that sort of structure of individuals within each cohort changes. Another important strategy in terms of pre-release is pre-release training of birds to recall to a station. And so choughs are very intelligent, as I've said, and they're very easy to recall to a trigger, such as a whistle, to a particular station. So that means that we can recall them after release back to either an aviary or you can see the target on the top right-hand picture there, and they will fly down we need to give them supplemental feeding. It's also for the post-release monitoring. We can recall the birds back and make sure they're safe, and that's part of the monitoring that is really strategically important in the Jersey projects, and so we're learning from that. So in addition to the recall training and supplemental feeding to support the birds, which starts pre and then continues post-release, health surveillance is obviously vital to ensure the welfare of the birds, both in the short and the long term. So obviously we're working closely with our vets at the International Zoo Vet Group and WVI to do that. GPS tags are also really important in terms of monitoring the birds, being able to track them post-release, looking at sort of dispersal rates, foraging behaviour, and to improve our understanding of how birds utilise the habitat. So we're very lucky, as I say, to have the Jersey data to learn from. And I think the takeaway key findings from the Jersey project is that subadult survival in these birds is much higher than it is in the wild birds. Secondly, the first successful breeding was much younger than in wild birds. So putting all of that together, what we're learning is that the reintroduction protocol and post-release support that we provide the birds demonstrates that using zoo-based expertise and techniques can establish a reintroduced population far more quickly than natural species recovery. I'll hand over to my colleague Suzanne just to tell you a little bit more about the other key components of the project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm going to talk about the public engagement side of the project. Obviously, an important part of the project is engaging with any project, as we all know, is engaging with stakeholders. And some of our stakeholders are going to be land managers for the areas where the chough are going to be released. So the land managers include, we've been working with the White Cliffs Countryside Partnership and also the National Trust over the past few years to help restore the habitat. As Laura mentioned, chough require a mosaic of different habitats. Some of that includes grazed grassland, so the livestock create the short sward that the choughs need to access the soil invertebrates and also the dung on which the chough feed. And what we want to do is, as part of working with the land managers, is to try and reduce the use of ivermectins, or at least change the way that they're administered. And we know we're kind of in the long haul with that sort of project, but you know it's part of what we want to do to increase biodiversity in the area. And then also we know that choughs use abandoned buildings for nesting, and having a conversation with someone earlier about the choughs in Kerry that have been known to use, a lot of buildings, in Ireland, we know that it happens. So we've engaged with English Heritage and other relevant landowners to ensure that they're aware of this, that they're not surprised if they find a chough in one of their buildings. And then more recently, we've been speaking to the Port of Dover Authority. Obviously, when we release the chough in Dover, that is one of the places that they may go. And all the conversations that we've had have all been really, really positive. So, hopefully that will continue. And then last but not least, we've been engaging with the general public about this project. So you may be aware, so Thomas Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century, was famously assassinated in the cathedral, but he had 3 choughs on his family coat of arms, which directly obviously links the chough to Canterbury for us. We're unsure why he has the chuff on his coat of arms. One of the story goes that his father, Gilbert, had a very long sort of hooked nose which resembled the chuff curved bill. So it's quite a nice story to tell. Obviously, we don't know for definite. And there's also quite a nice origin story of the chuff, which is based around Thomas à Becket's assassination, which sadly I don't have time to tell you about now, but there is a Lego depiction of it on our website if you'd like to check that out afterwards. And you can see there, obviously, because the chuffs are on Thomas Becket coat of arms, they have been adopted by the City of Canterbury, and that is the Canterbury Mayor, Pat Todd, who is a big fan of the project as well. Also, on the slide there, we've got King Lear. So Shakespeare wrote about the chuffs in King Lear, and that places the chuffs right, on the White Cliffs at Dover. One of the cliffs is called Shakespeare's Cliff. So what we wanted to do was really, let the people of Kent know that the chuff, belongs to them. People know the chuff as sort of the Cornish chuff in England, and we wanted to say, well, no, it's the Kentish chuff as well. So part of our engagement programme has been centred around an aviary, which is actually in Dover Castle. So English Heritage have been working with us on this project as well. These are 4 crest-reared birds that Laura and I raised last year at WIldwood, and they've been a really great part of the public engagement programme. And of course, Dover Castle has thousands of visitors every summer, so that's a really sort of wide reach for us. And we've also been running sort of family events in the middle of Dover and at Canterbury Cathedral, and one of my colleagues actually designed that chuff aeroplane there on the right, which is a really great public engagement tool, and really gets the kids engaged with the project. And also we've produced producing an education pack. It's nearly finished, and that's going to be freely available to schools that visit WIldwood, that visit Dover Castle, and areas around Dover. We're going to make that sort of very, very accessible. So when considering the social feasibility of a reintroduction of this culturally iconic species to Kent, the first step was to reconnect the people of Kent to their lost heritage. The species has been missing from the landscape, as Laura mentioned, for approximately 200 years. So the first step was to put the bird back into the hearts and minds of the local community. What was really great for us was that an art foundation in Dover decided to include the chuff in their local lantern procession. If that's going to come up, there we go. So, and that was a really great event, and that we mentioned the project to them, and they just came up with that, which we thought was absolutely fantastic. And we are hoping, of course, so this is all about the Cornish chuff. I'm assuming the Irish chuff brings the same sort of socio-economic benefits to you, but we're hoping this is what is going to happen, for Kent, and we're going to actually have a whole ecotourism around the bird. So yeah, that does conclude the talk. I do want to say a special thanks to the team at Jersey Zoo, who've obviously really been advising us, and we have been lucky enough to persuade Liz Corrie, who is leading their team on the chuff reintroduction, to come over to Kent, and she's going to be our chuff release supervisor, and we'll be following the birds with the radio trackers and the GPS trackers. And also, of course, to Paradise Park that Laura mentioned, which have been invaluable in the captive breeding side of the programme. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for that. Next up, we're going a bit closer to home, and we're going to Fota. I'm sure most of you have been, but we have Sean McKeown, the director of Fota, who's going to talk about some projects that are more native species focused.
Okay, we can't see this. So basically, Christoph has gone through some of the changes that have happened since our menagerie days in the early 19th century. Things have changed a lot since then. So zoological institutions are the leading contributors to conservation in nature at a national and global level. They're also one of the third highest contributor to global conservation in the world. So that's collectively worldwide. So it's a growing theme with zoos around the world. So the main area is the ex situ breeding of endangered species, and these are often linked to in situ projects like the one plan approach that was talked about earlier by Kira. Obviously, Fota has a large education program for students and also for visitors around behavioural change. And then we have a large research side of things, mainly linked to ex situ aspects in the wildlife park, but also in situ species as well. And that's linked to University College Cork, who actually own 70% of the land that Fota Wildlife Park's on. So it's now the species down here at the bottom. The reason that's there was because they're species I liked, number one. But they're also symbolic in a way that with zoos, the species became extinct exactly 50 years ago in the wild, and through captive breeding in zoos and wildlife parks, but also in Oman itself, have been reintroduced to the wild, and now there are around 1,500 in free-ranging animals in the Middle East. So it's a huge return. And then the top right is Europe's largest mammal, land mammal, extinct in the wild the beginning of the 20th century, has now been returned to the wild, to Poland, to southern Romania, and throughout a number of countries in Europe now. And Fota Wildlife Park has been breeding and sending animals to the wild in Poland, to Romania, and you can see here at the bottom right is one of the females above in the wild in Romania. This was in February, where they had very cold weather, and you can see how well the coat of the animal works. The body heat doesn't escape, and the snow is actually lying on the animal. So obviously, bison coats were in demand, and probably one of the causes that made them become extinct in the wild. So closer to home, Fota got involved in a natterjack toad head starter program, and it came about because the National Parks and Wildlife Service introduced a scheme for farmers in 2008 to dig up to 2 ponds, because they couldn't dig more, and they would get, I think it was 500 or 1,000 euros per pond. And the ponds were there to assist in expanding the range of the toads in Kerry. They started using translocating spawn from ponds that naturally had toads to new ponds, new sites. It wasn't very successful. So in 2015, they came to us, approached us to see if we could come up with ways of improving this and perhaps rearing spawn to toadlet stage and then releasing. We started that in 2016 with the initial rearing of toads, and I think it was 500 we released in the first year. And these are the toadlets here on the, I don't know whether there's a point, there is, it doesn't work on the TV. On the bottom right, you can see the toadlets where they've still got their, they've got their tail and their, in some cases, front legs, back legs, so they're going through the process of metamorphizing, and it's when they get to this toadlet stage, which is here, but on the, at this stage, they are released to the wild. So 2017, Dingle Aquarium also got on board in this project, and between both organisations, we have released about 10,000 toads back to the wild in that period. 2020 was probably, during COVID, was probably the biggest release that we had. We had Fota released 2,600 and Dingo, I think, was about 800. So since then, we've had years where the ponds have been drying up and issues around spawning in the Maries in Kerry. And this year, what has happened is there has been no spawning because of the very extremely dry spring, showing signs of issues around climate change. Fortunately, it was also the first year that we've actually bred them in Fota, and we still expect this year to be able to release 500 toadlets back to the wild. That's the stage it is at the moment. You can see the Minister Noonan last year visited Fota to see the process that we were doing in Fota, and then also at the release site in Kerry. He was there for the final release of toads last year. So he's taken an active interest in it. But we really now need to put more effort into seeing how successful the releases are, and how much or how large the dispersal of the toads are in the area. It's going to be a difficult process, but there are a few ideas out there. And we have a PhD student started last September to take on that work. The other programme that we started in more recent times, but we actually had concretes in Fota since it was 2013. And the idea was that we would have built up the capacity to breed concretes, so at some future date they would be useful for either taking birds that were or chicks that were found in the wild, and being able to rear them and possibly later release them. But that sort of one of those cases actually happened in 2019, where a chick was found wandering around Donegal Airport. It was 2 days old, and eventually we got it to Cork, and it has been reared. It's a female and has produced offspring, so we've at least breeding 50% native concretes, and it's worked quite well. But in the process, we were approached by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. We would like to be involved in the EU Concrete Life project. Tronach is the Irish word for concrete, and that we jumped at. We're very delighted to be involved in it. The main areas around the Concrete Life project are securing landowner cooperation, either through and also securing land as well by buying it, owning it in local communities, and involving them in the support of concrete conservation. On your right hand, on the top diagram there, you can see the Donegal, Mayo, and some on the Aran Islands. That's the remaining populations of concrete. It's 8 sort of subpopulations, and they're really the fringes of the northwestern fringes of Ireland, in Gaeltacht areas. It's quite poor land, and one of the reasons they survive there is that it was the type of farming that they used there. So what was changed in recent times is that people there would have planted potatoes, oats, grown their own crops, and these are late developing crops, late harvesting crops, so they provided cover for the concrete. And now the effort is being put into developing these lake cover crops. You can see here that's oats, a mixture of oats, etc. Then on the left-hand side, which is the later crops, and then on the left-hand side is a wildflower meadow. So you have early cover, late cover, and both those things are important for managing the concrex in the wild. So improving, these were trying to improve the effective conservation measures, but also using science to understand these more. We are also looking at improving management regimes for the concrex in the project sites. So, the whole EU Life project has done that. The early cover I've talked about, the improving exchange between farmers and planners in the project sites. Surprisingly, COVID has helped in that exchange because large meetings weren't possible. So the exchange, their interaction with farmers and landowners has been on a one-to-one basis. And there was some animosity towards concrex and from farmers in the area, particularly when you got groups of people together. You would have people, if you had people standing and trying to explain the benefits of concrex and what needs to be done, you'd have the people who have issues around concrex and issues around farming and incomes, etc., would be very vocal. But on a one-to-one basis, they've been able to interact with the local community much better. And once you get one or two farmers involved and active, that persuades others. So that has been very successful, and it's one of the outcomes I think they'd like to push to the EU, because what they wanted was more of an open public interaction in sort of your town hall where you'd have large groups of people, and that really wouldn't have worked in this case. So it's proved very successful and may be used in other aspects as well of bird and conservation projects in Ireland. So, so I go back a bit. So the main elements that Fota is involved in is around the protection, rescue and research initiatives for concrex. Either because we have the hatching and rearing and capacity at Fota, this is relatively easy for us to do. If chicks or eggs, deserted nests, etc., are found, then they are incubators, etc., ready in the areas, unlike the previous situation. So it should prove much easier to save any abandoned concrex. We're also involved in developing much more of the applied science to be able to find at-risk nests in areas, such as using thermal imaging and also using wildlife detection dogs to find nests. So here we've been doing a research project with GMIT and a dog owner, a wildlife detection dog, to see how the concrex react to the presence of this dog. And these are there's a camera shot of a video shot of the birds, and it's amazing. The concrex react almost as the person is coming within 30, 40 meters away. They show a reaction to dogs. And we know that dogs, in many cases, are present and more common than they used to be, particularly over COVID as pets, etc. So even from that, it shows that dogs can be an issue, and there may be areas on islands and things that they can limit the impact of dogs on concrex. We're also involved in developing the local community engagement programs through our education department, and this is also proving very successful. and we're also involved in the overall project management. Other native species conservation projects we're involved in. We're lucky enough to have a large population of red squirrels on Fota Island itself. They're very distinct from other populations throughout Cork and throughout the rest of the country, because they're an island population. But we did a postdoctoral study on the occurrence on the island, their particular habitats they use, the trees they most frequent, and one of the outcomes of that study is that we've started to plant a lot more yew trees, oak trees, and beech trees, which are the three main trees that they really like, and particularly yew trees, because they nest a lot in yew trees. They also provide a lot of shelter for them in winter as well, and they're a very important aspect to red squirrels in Fota. We've also been involved in the Irish native bee species, or native bee project that commenced in Fota in 2017, where we placed 7 hives around, and 6 of those have been occupied. One of those 6 was actually occupied by instead of seeding from other native bees, this was a hive that actually self-seeded. So they were actually on the island or in the area, which was really, really good to look at. The ladybirds also are part of a PhD that was undertaken in the Cork area, mainly looking at the occurrence of the invasive harlequin ladybird, and that had become more frequent in Cork, and that's been monitored over the last 3 or 4 years. That project is just been completed, so we should have more study on that, more results on that. Great Partridge project, we just started that last year. We're trying to release around the island. And then the last one is the Curlew Head Starter program, which is only started this year. Can't tell you too much about it because it's only in its infancy. Initial signs are quite good, and it's a sort of a hope for the hopefully part of the overall actions that we can take to try and save the curlew in Ireland. So we're also developing an education and conservation centre, which will also have a research area as well. We have very close links with University College Cork. It'll have a 250 lecture-seater theatre, as well as a research labs. You can see here we have a large focus on research with UCC and some of the educational activities that take place there. So hopefully this will be finished by sort of the end of next year, and will hopefully, like Dublin Zoo, start to have a paradigm change and focus on conservation research and education.
Thank you. I realise we're running behind, so if anyone needs to get back to the plenary, please feel free. If not, we'll go straight on to John Lusby, Raptor Officer with Birdwatch Ireland, who will talk about some raptor research that the zoo has helped support as well.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you, Christoph, as well. You're getting a lot of thank yous thrown your way this afternoon, so there's another one for you. I'm going to have to be very disciplined because it's a similar problem to Laura. Usually when I'm talking about barn owls, I talk for an hour or more, so I'm going to try and condense that all into a hectic 10 minutes. So delighted to be talking in this forum, and this is hold on, I just figure out the gadget. There we go. This is the bird that all the fuss is about. So it's fair to say that barn owls have been definitely a priority species for us in Birdwatch Ireland for many years now, and definitely one that I've devoted quite a lot of my adult life to studying, learning more about, and then enacting that conservation. And that has been to a large extent possible through the support of Dublin Zoo. And I was looking back at records of, we actually had support from the zoo since 2009, which is fantastic, because that, I think, is hugely valuable in that that there's very few single species monitoring studies that we have in Ireland that we can track changes in populations over time, learn about the specific factors that are affecting their populations, and then use that to inform their conservation. And we have been able to do that on barn owls, which is fantastic. And as I say, having the continuity through the support of Dublin Zoo has made that possible. So I suppose and to mention as well, I think barn owls is particularly important because they are a top predator. So obviously, one of the main focuses of the work is to understand the factors that affect barn owl populations. I'll talk a little bit about their decline, so to understand what has caused that decline, so that then obviously we can help to restore their populations. But through the course of studying barn owls, we can learn so much more about the wider ecosystem, because obviously they are a top predator, so affected by many factors, the lower levels of the food chain. But as well as that, because they're a top predator, a lot of the conservation measures that we deliver are, it doesn't stop at barn owls. They're beneficial, throughout the environment, throughout the countryside, and often focusing on small mammals. So I think because of that, very relevant to the National Biodiversity Action Plan and strategy, and we've worked a lot with implement the actions through the National Biodiversity in previous iterations of the plan. So just to step back a bit, so probably one of the reasons that we started focusing on barn owls initially was because of concern over their populations, because we became increasingly aware that their population was essentially in trouble, and we were noticing quite extensive, quite significant declines. So this is a map showing the barn owl distribution back in the late 60s, early 70s throughout Ireland and Great Britain, derived from the Breeding Bird Atlas, which essentially a survey carried out to assess distribution of all bird species across Ireland and Britain, and carried out every 20 years. So this being the first one, there's been three breeding atlases in total. So you can see at that point that barn owl is reasonably widespread throughout the country. But then if we fast track 20 years on, that the situation had changed quite dramatically. In Ireland in particular, the declines weren't at all as severe in Great Britain, but obviously you can see there quite a worrying situation in Ireland. And it was that time really that we noticed similar declines in other farmland species, and you've heard about curlew, corncrake, also chough as well. So and large part of those declines are, at that time, intensification of farming practices, changes, in land use, and barn owl being very much a bird of lowland farmland, obviously suffered through due to those land use changes. So another 20 years on, the situation seemed a little bit more positive, but I would add the caveat that was also the time that we had started, to really intensely focus on barn owls, that we had started to survey, to document nesting sites, and to implement protection measures. So that they are a red-listed bird conservation concern, and that's in the national, the Irish context. So so we have, based on a traffic light system, the red-listed bird conservation concern, with obviously those categorised on the red list being those that are most endangered, those that we're most worried about, and barn owl, along with several other farmland birds, have been on the red list since its initiation, and remain on the red list for the most recent red list, which covers this period. And hopefully in time, I'll talk a little bit about the changes in population and the more positive trajectory, but hopefully in time we'll be in a position that we can potentially remove barn owl from the red list, but unfortunately not there just yet. So I suppose the basis of the project, there's many different elements, a lot of overlap. It's interesting actually to talk on chough. There's a lot of overlap in terms of, the basis of it is the same. It's understanding about the species, why they've declined in the first place, and what needs to be done to address those factors. And that's essentially what we set out to do. Some of those factors are fairly fairly obvious and fairly straightforward to address, others more complex. One of the things that became obvious quite early on was the dependency of barn owls on structures like this, on old ruin stone structures. And this is a topic that I could talk about and have done for an entire talk. As somewhat of a fetish when it comes to ruined buildings, just because they're so incredibly important for biodiversity, and they're obviously used by barn owls, but a whole range of other species like peregrine, kestrel, swift, chough as well for buildings along the coast. But obviously, obviously this is quite an impressive ruined historic structure. But the smaller, like the likes of abandoned farmhouses, where they're lost in the countryside. That can obviously affect barn owls and other species which are dependent on them, because it obviously reduces the availability of nest sites. You can see like some of the older farm buildings that you can see here, and you can see special access there at the top that allow birds access into the loft space and to nest. And obviously these were very, very widespread throughout the Irish countryside at one time, but as they're being replaced by more modern farmyards, the nesting opportunities are much less. But that's something that is pretty straightforward to address, and something that we've had a lot of success with by providing nest boxes. And it's something through support with the zoo that we have invested quite a focus towards, and that's through both ourselves through Birdwatch Ireland installing nest boxes at suitable sites, but also increasing capacity amongst local community groups, other conservation groups, to build and install nest boxes, which then we help monitor. And we've surpassed over 1,000 nest boxes now throughout the country that we monitor, and this season we're going to reach over 100 that are used by breeding barn owl, which is fantastic. And it's something that has, I remember when we started putting up nest boxes, I remember the first year or two going back very excitedly to check all the nest boxes, and no signs of activity at any of them, and almost you'd forget about some of the nest boxes. But it's really built in, and particularly in recent years, and with each year there's increased number of nest boxes being used, which is fantastic, because that means that the birds are in safe and secure sites. They're in areas that obviously we've chosen because they're suitable, and there is suitable foraging habitat around there. So likely the birds, the birds are quite safe. And I'll give some examples of in situations where they might be at risk in other buildings due to developments and unintentional disturbance. But this is just an example. This is a farmer in Offaly that had noticed a bird using the barn there during the winter, and very, very simple, put up a nest box off his own bat, and pretty much straight away the birds started using it. And you can see there that's quite a typical active, busy farmyard. Of which there are, literally thousands throughout the countryside. And I'd like to say that we've, with the Department of Agriculture, helped develop a specific barn owl measure for the next agri-environment scheme, which is going to increase the number of nest boxes quite substantially in the coming years as well, which is fantastic. And then some much more elaborate artificial nest sites, as you can see this one here, where the person that was building this site included a specific nesting chamber for barn owls within the new build, and the birds happily took to it, and he's able to watch them up close and personal with the nest camera here. It should actually be footage, but I'm not sure how. Hold on. Oh no, that's not what I intended to do. Maybe you can sort me out there. The footage was of the barn owl chick just bobbing its head. I'm not going to try and copy it, but I'm afraid you just have to imagine a barn owl. There you go. Oh, well, I clicked the... Oh, not to worry. Anyways, so to give you an example of where, because obviously barn owls are so, apart from the nest boxes, because they're so dependent on particularly ruined buildings, derelict buildings, they can be at risk of unintentional disturbance of, where the buildings are being renovated, being developed. And every summer, including, even yesterday, we have many examples of, you know, where birds are unintentionally disturbed, where, you know, like this example, this is a cottage down in North Cork. This is from last breeding season, and the builders were the birds were nesting between the newer galvanised roof, the sheets, and the old turf roof beneath it. And the builders were taking off the sheets of galvanise, and got a bit of a surprise when they came upon 4 barn owl chicks. And they did everything right at the time. They contacted us. We were able to return the chicks to the nest. They put back the roof exactly as they found it, and we put up a nest box close by. And then they waited until we were able to tell them that the chicks had fledged, and they were able to continue with the works. And obviously, then with there being a suitable nest in very close proximity. So that happens very frequently at nest sites throughout the breeding season. But by using nest boxes, that can obviously, you know, have a huge benefit. One of the other areas then that we really focused on quite intensely was trying to understand what was driving the mortality of barn owls on roads, and on major roads in particularly. And this was quite a substantial research project. We worked with Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and this came about because we had started to notice quite high mortality rates of barn owls on major roads, and particularly on certain major roads, the M8 in particular, which is the motorway between Cork and Dublin. And so for obviously, you know, a bird that is still very scarce, obviously such high mortality levels quite worrying, and potential to have a population level effect. So we wanted to learn more about what was influencing risk of mortality on the roads, and why they were, you know, being clustered in certain hotspots as well. So one of the areas that we did look at was the behaviour of individual birds in relation to roads, and that really hadn't been looked at anywhere else before, and it was very revealing in the Irish context. And to do that, we looked at we fitted adult birds with GPS transmitters, and you can see here and we did that with birds close to major roads, just to see, you know, were they avoiding major roads, were they you know, interacting or crossing the roads regularly, and were they even hunting alongside the roadside verges. And as you can see from these maps here, that that's exactly what they were doing. They were spending, it was quite surprising, a large amount of time over the course of a night actually hunting up and down along the motorway verges, and the reason for that being probably reflective of poorer quality in the wider countryside, but the long strips of semi-natural rough grassland being obviously very suitable for small mammals, and therefore very enticing from the barn owl's perspective. The red dots there where the bird was stationary for some time or perched, so obviously spending a lot of time perched just along the roadside verges. I'm not sure if the videos, there's a short video on this. There we go. So this is just an adult female barn owl that was, you can just see the GPS tag, so obviously very careful not to cause any disturbance at the nest, and obviously under license. But the information we were getting back was absolutely phenomenal. So it would take a fix of the bird's location every 5 seconds for a period of up to about 2 weeks or a little more. So we would be able to build up a quite precise picture of exactly where the bird was going and foraging. Hopefully this. There we go. So this is just to give you a very brief glimpse of the movements or the foraging of one particular female at that nest site. So this is her going off on a hunting trip, and you can see that when she goes out, she just starts to hug the hedgerows, hug the hedgerows, which is obviously, you know, where the small mammals are. And this is quite an intensive landscape in South Tipperary, so the interior of the fields, you know, improved pasture, obviously no good for small mammals. But then comes to the edge of the motorway, the M8 motorway, and we can tell quite precisely, you know, down to a few meters where she perched. And then we can also tell that she caught prey there, because then after that she flies in, you know, a much faster direct flight back to the nest site, which is where the chicks are. The hungry mouths are waiting. So it was very revealing to, you know, to see just how important the roadside verges were from a foraging perspective. And we wanted to to use those learnings in relation to developing mitigation measures. And then we worked, it was kind of a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but we worked to use that ecological information with the engineers and road design planners within Transport Infrastructure Ireland to essentially develop these mitigation standards, which I'm delighted to say are now a requirement for all new major road projects in the country. So this is all very new, and the next phase is to essentially assess the effectiveness of these mitigation measures to reduce mortality of barn owls in major roads. The basis of it being that the suitable foraging conditions are maintained, but that there's a natural tree line to force the birds above the height of oncoming vehicles when they are crossing the road. Very briefly then, and I'm going to end on a positive note, but just to say one of the other areas that we're working a lot on is the exposure of rodenticides to barn owls and other wildlife, which is still a serious issue in Ireland. And again, we've been working with the Department of Agriculture to try and improve rodent control measures within the next agri-environment scheme, but it is something that we have seen. We've carried out tests of barn owls in Ireland and showed that over 88% of birds that we tested are exposed to rodenticides, which is obviously really, really worrying. It's not just barn owls, it's a whole range of other wildlife, and it's not just predatory species or scavenging species either. So something definitely that that is requires a lot more focus. Just to end then, as I said, on a positive, and I think as Ciara was saying as well, sometimes it can be all doom and gloom in terms of species declines, but this shows all the barn owl sites that we have recorded since we started the work, which is just under 700 at this stage, and it'll reach over 700 this year, which is phenomenal. Again, it's come a long way since we started, when we were finding just a handful of nest sites, and a huge element of it is citizen science, because barn owls are so well known, so well loved. We really rely on that, and rely on the input of landowners, the general public, and these are all the barn owl sightings just from last year that were reported to us, which is hugely useful. Really allows us to build up information on the distribution of the population, and also to locate nest sites. So at the moment we're carrying out intensive county-wide surveys last year and this year, and so just to give you a glimpse of the findings, as I said, to end on a positive note, this County Kilkenny here showing the confirmed breeding pairs and probable breeding pairs within 10 kilometres square. So if we compare that to just 10 years ago, you can see that the map 10 years ago is on the left compared to what we found last year. What we've seen is that in all of the counties that we looked at last year, that we're seeing an increase in barn owl populations, which is again something that I never thought that I would witness. And if we go back and compare the situation 50 years ago, the distribution of barn owls in County Kilkenny, it's actually slightly higher from our findings last year. Similar situation in Galway. You can see it's interesting here. This is County Galway. There's very little going on out west, which is Connemara, but quite well distributed in East Galway. But again, similar situation. If we compare the known distribution 10 years ago to last year, it shows quite a significant increase, and almost similar to what it was 50 years ago, which again is absolutely phenomenal. I'd love to say that it's all down to the conservation measures that we've implemented, but that wouldn't be true. And it's actually seems to be it's an area that we're focusing on a lot at the moment to look at the reasons behind this slow population recovery. But we do suspect that it's strongly influenced by the spread of these guys, the greater white-toothed shrew, which is a non-native introduced small mammal, and also the bankfoal. And as these species, which are very important in the barn owl diet, as they slowly spread across the country, we're seeing a change in fortunes for barn owls. So, which is good for barn owls. It obviously, with introduced or invasive species, there's potential for negative consequences for other species, and we are seeing that as well for particularly other small mammals. But for barn owls, it is giving us a really good opportunity to ensure that that as the population is slowly recovering in certain or most parts of the country, that we implement the measures to ensure that we stabilise the population, and that in another 10 years' time we're not looking at declines again. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too much over the 10 minutes. I probably did. And just to say a few thank yous, because as well as Dublin Zoo, there's a huge range of stakeholders involved and organisations that have supported the Barn Owl work since its initiation. And thanks again to Dublin Zoo for the ongoing support.
Thank you, John. If anyone needs to leave, please feel free to leave. Last up, we have Dr. Matthew Jebb from the Botanical Gardens, who will talk to us a bit more about plant conservation.
Right. Well, I'll reward you all by making sure I only speak for, let's say, 4 minutes, shall we? Caring for plants. One of the big problems is exactly what we have seen here. Just a lot of talk about animals, wildlife. Most of you can recognize those two animals. But I don't know if there's maybe one person in the room, maybe two, who'll be able to identify these two plants, the sawwort and the rannoch rush, both now extinct in Ireland. So it's no wonder you probably haven't encountered them. But from the earliest years, of course, children get a great empathy with animals, things that are almost sentient beings. And as animals get further and further away from primates, then that sentience starts to disappear. And there's a moment where you sort of doubt whether that animal even recognizes you as another living creature. And of course, once you reach plants, then there's no hope. These plants don't seem to empathize with people, and people don't empathize with them. So it's a very important thing that pets, when children are given pets, they learn to empathize with animals. They also learn about responsibility of looking after animals. And it's well proven that encouraging children just to handle and even plant seeds is a great way for them to learn to empathize with plants. Here's another extinct plant, the club sedge. It's been in our living collections for most of the years that it has gone from the wild. And an important point about botanic gardens is we hold, in all the botanic gardens around the world, about 30% of all living species of plant, which is an extraordinary thought. And there are 200 species of plant held in botanic gardens that are now extinct in the wild. Had we not had botanic gardens, probably extinction rates in plants would have been 34% higher, according to the IUCN. Here is another plant that used to be abundant around Loch Derg. This is the Irish fleabane, Inula salicina, and even Robert Lloyd Prager said, "It is not yet fully known what affects the Shannon electricity works," this is Udna Crusher, "by which the water of the lake is raised to about winter level, may have on the plant, but there is little reason to fear for it. It was that abundant just in the 1930s. Now there's probably half a dozen plants left on the shores of Loch Derg because the water level is stabilised. There's no longer this sort of tidal zone, if you like, from the winter and summer levels. But if you go to Siberia, you will see that Inula salicina likes to grow in very barren spots at the edges of rivers that's inundated for most of the year because it cannot stand competition. So it grows very well in a flower bed, but it does not grow well in the wild anymore. Here are 4 plants on the cusp of extinction in Ireland, the cottonweed top right and the Irish fleabane top left, both of them easy to grow in cultivation. And the bottom 2, the meadow saxifrage and the hairy St. John's wort, those grow naturally in the Botanic Gardens in that they've been introduced and they look after themselves. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the cottonweed, a project that Nolene Smith has been running from the Botanic Gardens, and point out here one person in the background, Tony Murray. Tony Murray will be one of the frontline troops. As a ranger, he is responsible for looking after the wildlife in this country, and we should recognise the importance of those rangers who are, we all know, poorly paid. Their career prospects are very limited, and yet they are the frontline troops. Mike Wise-Jackson on the left there, and Adele MacDonald, one of our foremen in the Botanic Gardens formerly. She's now retired. But we are here planting cottonweed plants, and Nolene Smith is behind the camera, by the way, replanting cuttings and seedlings raised from the 14 plants that persisted in 2018. So only 14 plants existed at that time. So we have now in captivity, if you like, an example of every single one of those clones growing in our collection. Some have been raised as seeds, but the majority from cuttings. And number 12 is now extinct in the wild, but we still have it in the collection. So these are opportunities to replant, to give that population a boost, if you like. And here's an interesting fact that you learn from repeat visits. Top image, That is what the plant looked like in 2018. Bottom right, 1 year later, you see it's dying off at the base. And what we've discovered in the gardens is if you cover up the base with sand, that is exactly what it loves. This plant wants to be buried under grit and gravel. And what's happening in the wild is probably the habitat is changed. And it's changed for all sorts of reasons. But an important point, here is the sole surviving population of 14 plants, Ladies Island Lake in Wexford, the red star. The white circles are previous populations now gone extinct. We're probably keeping this plant going in the last place it wants to live in. It may have completely different habitat requirements to what is left at its disposal now. So I think we need to think in much broader and braver terms about how to preserve plants and whether just returning them to their current habitats is the right way of doing it, because they're simply surviving in certain out-of-the-way places that may not be optimum. We've had an excellent opportunity in Botanic Gardens over the last 20 years with the global strategy for plant conservation has given us a set of 16 excellent targets. And one of those is Target 8, which is growing threatened plants in ex situ populations in Botanic Gardens. And we have got 25% of the 100-odd threatened plants in Ireland in our living collection at the moment. And we learn from them, as we did with the cottonweed, about how these plants probably want to be, to the sort of habitats that they're experiencing in captivity. We learn from that and show that we can actually manage those in situ populations in a particular way. The OPW has now launched a biodiversity action strategy, and many of us from the Botanic Gardens were deeply involved with that. And that is a useful way for, as an organization, somebody who, or an organization that spends a lot of time interfering with habitats in flooding and drainage. We manage heritage properties like Castletown House there, which has got an excellent wildflower meadow that has simply been managed in an appropriate manner. So this, I hope this strategy will ensure that all our sites become havens for nature. This interesting article appeared just the other day in the Irish Times. I saw Kevin O'Sullivan this morning. I think he was only listening to the various ministers speaking, but he was reporting on the Mary Mulvihill lecture. Any of you who met Mary Mulvihill will know she was a great communicator, and one of her great ideas was this fact that science is part of our culture, and unfortunately, in nation building, we look to art and literature and architecture, and we omitted to recognize science and biodiversity as part of our culture. And that was mentioned by several speakers this morning in plenary, the importance of putting biodiversity back into our culture so that it becomes something that we will guard and look after. Thank you very much. I don't know if people are going to stay even longer.
I won't hold all the speakers here. The plenary is still happening, so if you want to go back to that, please feel free. If you're sticking around for the zoo social this evening, that will be happening around 6:30. Buses will be available from the main courtyard, and that'll be going on till around 9 p.m. But thank you all so much for sticking with us. Went over a little bit longer than we expected, but we hope you found some part of it useful and inspiring moving forward. Thank you all so much.